Leading global business educator and a specialist in leadership strategies is Dr. Liz Mellon. She's the executive director at Duke Corporate Education. She's recently published her book, Inside the Leader's Mind. This is it. And she joins me now in studio to discuss effective leadership traits of global corporate captains. Thanks so much for your time. Liz, in your career, you've worked with numerous CEOs of FTSE 100 companies. You've been coming in and out of South Africa for the last 15 years. What's the common denominator? What makes a leader a great leader in the 21st century?
You know, Lerato, lovely to be here, by the way, and lovely to meet you. It's one of the things that's puzzled me. So I've actually been coming in and out of South Africa for 15 years, but working in business education, leadership education for 25. And one of the pieces that has puzzled me is exactly that, what distinguishes the leader. And I think we focus a lot on behaviour. We worry about how a leader behaves, which makes sense because, you know, if you treat me well, I'll feel better about following you than if you don't treat me well. But I think we've missed something, and I think what we've missed is how a leader thinks. So my book is really about peeking inside the leader's mind and asking how the leader thinks. And that's what I've found is that leaders think in 5 remarkably similar ways.
Talk us through those 5 very briefly.
I like to think of it as the fingers of one hand, and the kind of centre is the thumb, because the thumb touches all the other 4, and that's the solid core, and that says I have strong values, I'm authentic, you're being led by someone you can trust. Leaders make change happen. If we just wanted status quo, we'd hire managers. Leaders make change happen, so they take risk, no safety net. They're comfortable with that. I mean, it takes them into uncharted territory. It's not always clear which way they should go, but they live with that tension, they swallow it, they don't pass it on to other people, they still look confident. They're okay being discomfortable, if you like. They think very carefully about the future, but they're also thinking about the past. So they're thinking about valuing the past, but also moving towards a different future. And then the 5th one is, I am the enterprise, which means that they really represent faithfully what the enterprise or the organisation stands for.
Let's begin with those core values, because the book is divided into 7 chapters around those 5 core tools. The idea of personal tools, I grapple with this one because I always say to people, increasingly we're told that you are a personal brand. You know, I may work for CNBC, but I am Lerato Mbele first and foremost. And who I am, my integrity needs to come through, but that also needs to reinforce my loyalty to CNBC. Often I think these two are very conflicting principles, but you're saying not.
I don't think so, and I think that, you know, CNBC would be less without you, but you also would be less without CNBC, and I think it's exactly the same for corporates. It's a symbiotic relationship. So I don't know if you scuba dive. I love scuba diving, and there's there are these beautiful little striped fish called clownfish, and they sit in the anemone. And it's a symbiotic relationship because the anemone looks out for the fish and protects it, and the fish looks out for the anemone and protects it. One can't survive without the other. I think it's the same. I think you need to follow a leader who you can trust, who has strong values. You know that they're looking out for you and the organisation, not just building their own career. So that's important. But at the same time, the organisation needs to look after the leader, but one can't be without the other. It's about bringing the two together, and the best leaders really represent the organisation.
How does that principle apply in the modern day? You know, because somebody wants to find integrity for me as what you think, what you say, and what you do. All have to be the same thing. And often what leaders are thinking to grow the business, what they say in terms of encouraging the staff, and then what they do, especially in the midst of retrenchments, are often contradictory forces.
And that is what a wonderful way to look at it, because one of the pieces in the book is exactly that. You've got to say what you do and do what you say, and be consistent with your values and what the organisation stands for. Otherwise, you will lose people's trust, and trust, once it's lost, is very, very difficult to get back. But if you think about, you know, if I say Apple, what do you think? Steve Jobs, right? And, you know, if I say South Africa, what do you think? Nelson Mandela. Okay, so it's very important, and these are leaders who are consistent in their behaviour. They're consistent. Now, they may have to lay people off, they may have to suffer extremely hard times, but they're consistent throughout, and that's important.
You've also raised an interesting dichotomy of adversity and power, and I think it's that risk-taking element, is that you've got to be able to be in an uncomfortable position and make uncomfortable decisions, but ultimately you must be comfortable with having gone through that process.
Yeah. And that's what it defines leaders, actually, because you find people who don't have that leadership capability. They're too nervous, they're too worried, they can't cope with it. They get very emotional, they might shout at people. I don't know what, you've met some like that, okay? And it's these people who are able to just swallow that and say, part of my job is to look confident, to look upbeat, to live with that tension, but not to pass it on to others. I work with a wonderful woman called Irene Dorner. She's working actually for HSBC. She runs the Americas for them. And she uses a phrase which I think is very compelling. She says, I am always on. So when she steps out of her front door, it's like the light bulb. It's camera time. Yeah. She said, because I have to be there and be the leader my people need. I think the hardest thing to learn about leadership for individuals is that it's actually not about you. It's about what your followers need.
You've also said an interesting thing about positioning the future in the present, and I think in a lot of the work that you've done, this is the one thing you keep on banging on about, is 50% of your time must be dedicated towards some kind of a vision.
Yeah. If you just sit there, I mean, if CNBC just sits here and never innovates, just does the same old, the world's moving on, right? It'll move right past you and you'll be out of date and no one will want to watch CNBC anymore. So you have to keep moving, you have to keep taking that next step, you have to keep, and the way you do that is you think about the future. Now, what we know about people who run organisations is that if you ask them how long they think ahead, they'll say something like, oh, today it's far too difficult because the world's too turbulent and too complex, we can't possibly think ahead, but actually in 5 years I think, or in 10 years I think. So it is that ability to keep that eye on the horizon and not get sucked into today, which is busy and full of activities you need to do. How can you keep that clear mind to keep thinking about not enough, where do we need to go next?
Now, some of these the fundamentals that you're putting forward in this book, how would they apply in a country like South Africa? Because the business leader in South Africa will say, yes, that's great, Liz, all that you've said, but South Africa's a special country. It's a special environment. It's a few years after democracy. It's a society in transition. There are transformation issues. There are lots of regulatory issues. We've got to deal with the legacy of the past. We've got to consider a whole host of other things that leaders in London are not having to deal with day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And every leader and every country faces particular challenges. I feature a couple of South African leaders actually in the book. So, Jacko Maria's in there from Standard Bank, and he certainly endorses the 5 ways of thinking. So I would say leadership matters, leadership makes a difference, and these 5 ways of thinking are how real leaders think. The other thing I'll say is that when I ask leaders, and I do this every time I meet them, tell me about a leader you really admire, someone who you'd like to be like, someone who you'd like to emulate. They very rarely actually cite a corporate leader. Guess who I hear about 70% of the time?
Mum or dad, uncles?
No, it's Nelson Mandela.
Honestly?
Honestly. So this country has a lot to teach the world about leadership. I fundamentally believe that.
On that very poignant note, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Liz Mellon, who is the author of Inside the Leader's Mind, 5 Ways to Think Like a Leader.